This is Robin Chadderton and
Eleanor Blase.
with our group presentation for SLP491, neural correlates on sensory systems. So first off, the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system works in conjunction with our central nervous system to be able to give us motor control over our bodies. The peripheral nervous system consists of the somatic nervous system, which controls our voluntary muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls our involuntary muscles. And the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic nervous system, which is our arousing system, our fight or flight, and also the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our calming system, our rest and digest system. But what we're concerned more with is the sensory system that gives us the somatic system, which gives us the sensory input that we need for our motor control. So for us as SLPs, the peripheral nervous system is important for us in terms of sensation. The oral, laryngeal, and pharyngeal cavities are a rich sensory system. Speech and swallowing are sensory motor events in which we receive a constant flow of sensory information, which enables us to adjust and adapt our movements and what we do with our muscles as are necessary. For instance, when we swallow, our sensory information enables us to move smoothly from bringing food to our mouth to moving the food through our oral pharyngeal cavity and then determining when we can take our next bite. Damage to the peripheral nervous system can leave us with a decrease in sensation, a decrease in strength, and other deficits that will affect our ability to be able to speak or to swallow.
The thalamus is important for sensory integration. We have one in each cerebral hemisphere, which can affect classic left and right hemisphere functions. The thalamus has a main job, which is to relay sensory information to the cerebral cortex, but it also has other functions, including regulating motor activity, consciousness, stimulating wakefulness, and alertness. The thalamus consolidates incoming sensory information and prepares it to be sent to the primary somatosensory cortex. For example, sensory messages such as pain, touch, or temperature go through the thalamus, which sends the message to the primary somatosensory cortex for evaluation, where it is given meaning. On top of sensory information, the thalamus really is critical to so much of our functioning and even has functions that aren't as widely known or discussed. I'll talk about these on some further slides. The process for sensory integration is as follows. All information travels to certain nuclei in the thalamus specialized for specific sensory data. It is sent on to the primary somatosensory cortex for further processing and localization. Let's say you touch something very hot. This sensory information is sent through the thalamus onto the primary somatosensory cortex, which then sends a signal back down for you to remove your hand very quickly. All of this happens within a matter of seconds, even though the process seems really complicated. The thalamus communicates with all parts of the brain, and so its function is highly important. It isn't simply just a relay station. And current research tells us just that. The thalamus has a very central role and can actually shape the knowledge we use to interact with the world. Not only is it helping us to process sensory information, but it can be important in forming memories and directing behavioral functions. This is important to us as SLPs because we may see more than purely sensory deficits with someone who has thalamus damage.
We mentioned the primary somatosensory cortex as the landing site for sensory information packaged by the thalamus. It is located in the postcentral gyrus and is responsible for touch, registering of pain, temperature, and visual spatial information. It allows us to process sensation and localize it in space.
Damage to the thalamus or primary somatosensory cortex will impact sensory functions. We might see impairment of body and spatial awareness as well as motor control. If someone cannot feel their hands or lips, for example, they might not move them in the appropriate way to get what they want or need or even chew properly. We saw an example of this in an earlier lecture where this part of our brain helps us to reach for something with the right amount of force so that we don't overshoot or undershoot. Some patients with damage to these areas can't identify objects simply by touch. They wouldn't know a phone is a phone simply by touching it. They would also have to see it. We also might see decreased sensitivity to pain on one side of the body, or quite the opposite, a burning or aching sensation on one side of the body. We have looked at examples also of hemi-neglect, where a patient is neglecting their left visual field from right hemisphere damage. And we might even see memory loss, personality changes, or general apathy in personality when working with those who have damage to the primary somatosensory cortex or the thalamus. One of the most surprising articles that we found regarding the thalamus explains that the thalamus plays a very large role, and much larger than just the relay station, as I have hinted at before. Researchers have found that the thalamus is actually indicated when looking at speech and language functions. In fact, the thalamus is found to have direct ties to cortical language and motor speech systems. Damage to the thalamus can result in aphasia and even apraxia of speech. When we peel back the onion, so to speak, on this idea, it makes sense because we need to feel our mouths and articulators in order to know if we are making the correct movements and thus the correct sounds. We also wanted to include this slide, which shows the thalamus a little bit more deconstructed. This image is important because it shows us how many nuclei are in the thalamus alone, and how all of them are involved in processing and function in some way, shape, or form. Some of these nuclei are responsible for memory, emotional behavior, motor function, sensation, and or cognitive functions. It shows us just how critical the thalamus is for sensory information, but also for speech and language, which will be highly applicable to us as future speech-language pathologists.